I'm going to devote this entire episode to the question of whether IPAs are just pumpkin spice lattes for desperate middle-aged IT nerds. Actually, no. Let's talk about something important. Let's talk about Skinny Puppy. I had a really difficult time choosing a Skinny Puppy album to discuss here. I know I'll probably end up discussing several, but there are so many good ones and they all kind of mean something to me. For this episode, I chose their first live release, Ain't It Dead Yet? It was recorded from a show on June 1st, 1987 in Toronto. It was shortly after they released their fourth album, Cleanse, Fold, and Manipulate, just before they released Vivisect 6, which was their next album. And for my friends and I, it kind of functioned as a best of Skinny Puppy. So let's jump in the Wayback Machine and go back to that halcyon day, probably in 1990 when I first heard this band. I think I mentioned in a previous episode that I had taped their Cleanse, Fold, and Manipulate album on a cassette with Nights of Reb's Showtime on the flip side. Now, a friend of mine had that Skinny Puppy album and said, here's this band, it's Skinny Puppy, and, you're probably not going to like it. But, I taped it anyway, and he was wrong. I did like it. I liked it a lot. But I could kind of see what he meant. This band was very different from pretty much every other band that we were listening to at the time. And it couldn't be farther from bands like Van Halen and stuff that were on the radio at this time. Now, I don't have Cleanse, Fold, and Manipulate on CD, but the first track of that album is called First Aid. It's actually on this live album. It's track 6. So, First Aid is, a quintessential Skinny Puppy song. It's a representative track of theirs, if there is such a thing. So if I put myself back in that teenage headspace of first putting that tape in and hitting play, what was my reaction to hearing First Aid? Well, I have to think that my first impression was that there was just so much going on in that song. I mean, obviously it had a huge beat and this bass line that came in, but it was really obvious that they were using tons of samples and even micro samples, and these things were just swirling in and out of the mix. There were samples coming from, I'm supposing movies or things of that sort that just seemed to be part of the song, and they were put in exactly the right place. And the song didn't really have a lot of guitars or other rock instruments so much, but to me it definitely sounded industrial. But it was also very cinematic. It sounded like it was the score or soundtrack to a movie that I hadn't seen but really wanted to see. There wasn't much in the way of pop arrangements, or maybe it was that pop arrangements weren't as important in these tracks, and some of the tunes really sounded straight up like they were recorded straight off of late night monster movies, like with all the screaming and roaring and all the stuff you'd hear on that. So, for folks of a certain age, you might remember the console Zenith TVs we used to have back in the 70s and early 80s. And if you happened to be lucky enough to have a cassette recorder at that time, a little tape recorder, maybe with an external mic, you would put that recorder near the television, you'd run the external mic up over the volume knob, and you would press record, and you would be able to make a cassette tape of whatever was playing through that external speaker on the TV. So if you wanted to record, some monster movie or whatever it was, your favorite TV show, you could do that and listen back to it whenever you wanted, which was an amazing thing at the time. This is like late 70s, before VHS tapes, before VCRs. It gave us that ability to record this stuff. But listening back to Skinny Puppy made me remember these tapes that would have not only the audio from the television show we were trying to record, but the audio of everyone else in the room reacting to it. And that's what it sounded like to me to listen to these songs with all the different samples and the crazy arrangements that they had. There was just a lot going on, and it was really hard for me as a teenager to imagine musicians playing this music. I couldn't imagine what they were doing to make this sort of noise. And I didn't even know what a sampler was at this point in time, right? So it was hard to get my head around that. The most distinctive part of Skinny Puppy to me, though, was the singer. From listening to the first part of First Aid, I could tell he wasn't really singing so much as just vocalizing in all sorts of ways. His voice sounded like it was heavily processed, and it probably was, but as it turned out, you know, he mostly just sounded that way in real life. This guy had one of the most immediately identifiable voices in music. And to me, the lyrics seemed to be gibberish at first. It wasn't like, you know, a normal rhyme scheme that you would expect in a pop song, you know, A, B, C, C kind of rhyme scheme or something that you learn in English class. It just seemed to be a lot of random words, and I couldn't imagine how he memorized all these random words to sing. But when we read the words in the liner notes, they actually made some sense, to my surprise. And it was just amazing to me that, you know, this guy figured out how to write these sort of disjointed lyrics and actually make a comprehensible song about them. And that's what he did. So it was impressive. You know, the lyrics and the vocals were unlike anything else I had ever heard. So around this time, it must have been around 1990, we got into Cleanse, Fold, and Manipulate and some of the earlier albums. And shortly after, around this time, you know, we got into Vivisect 6. I think that came out in 1988. We got into all the associated industrial bands. We listened to Rabies. I think Rabies came out in 89. And with Rabies, it was important to my friends and I that, you know, Al Jorgensen of Ministry co-produced that album. So in our world, that tied these two bands together, Skinny Puppy and Ministry. There was a link there. And gradually our love of Skinny Puppy grew and grew, and eventually one of us stumbled on this live album. And it turns out it was actually a video too, but I first only knew of the CD because one of my friends got it as a birthday present for another friend, and inevitably we all made tape copies of it. And it actually wasn't until the early 2000s, maybe over 10 years later or so, that it even occurred to me to purchase the video and watch it, which is crazy in retrospect, but that's the way it happened. But I went out and, you know, I purchased the videotape, and here it is. I did hear that they made a DVD of this release, but I only had the VHS tape. I kept this tape even though I no longer own a VCR. So let's take a look at this here. Skinny Puppy, Ain't It Dead Yet Network catalog number. Look at this, folks. There's some honest-to-goodness videotape in here. That's pretty cool. I don't know why I still have this. It's probably nothing I'll ever play again, but it's pretty cool. I like the box. This videotape, magnetic tape, you know, that's some analog goodness. I have to wonder if all the analog purists out there, do they all watch VHS tapes instead of DVDs and Blu-rays? You know, do they go out and look for Viewmasters instead of looking at stuff on YouTube? I don't know. Like, what does Jack Black do? I have no idea. Who knows? Anyway, all of this stuff is on YouTube right now. You can go watch this entire video, this entire performance. Go do that right now instead of wasting your time with me. It's amazing. Okay? So, here it is, the CD and the VHS tape of this release. Both really awesome stuff. So all of this begged the question, who is this band? Like, when we first heard Skinny Puppy, we wanted to learn a little more about them. Unlike some of the bands that we were into, Skinny Puppy actually had liner notes on their albums, and those liner notes conveyed some amount of information, which was pretty amazing. So through those liner notes, we learned that these guys were from Canada. Okay, and not only did the land up north decide to bestow the world with maple syrup, hockey, curling, moose, and Rush, but they also gave us Skinny Puppy. However, Skinny Puppy were from Vancouver, Rush were from Toronto. So for those of you who aren't familiar with Canadian geometry, that's the West Coast versus the East Coast. separated by about 3,000 miles, so they probably didn't hang out too much. Anyway, Skinny Puppy's name came from the original concept behind the band, which was to convey life from a dog's point of view. And one of their first songs actually was called Canine for that reason. And you could hear that song on this CD, which is Back and Forth Series 2. It's Series 2 because their very first release was called Back and Forth, and it was a cassette, and that was Series 1. It was a very limited edition cassette that one of the band members duplicated by hand by himself. But here in the back, you can see track 3 is Canine, so you can check that out. It's fair to say they grew out of that concept over time, but it did kind of dovetail with their animal rights activism that they got into through, the middle part of their career and kind of embraced. They became ambassadors for animal rights, not unlike Moby, but in a cooler way. So around the time of this recording, in 1987 or so, there were 3 people in the band. The 2 founding members were these guys named Kevin Key and Nivik Ogre. Okay, so we gotta discuss the obvious question, which is what the heck is up with those names, right? So the root problem that they were trying to solve with these names is that these were 2 guys who were both named Kevin. And, you might realize that having 2 people with the same name in a band can get pretty confusing, especially if they're the only 2 people in the band. You might want to ask the Johns from They Might Be Giants about that. Anyway, Kevin Crompton decided that he would become Kevin Key, and that's Kevin spelled with a lowercase c, capital E, lowercase V-I-N, okay, in case you were wondering. Kevin Ogilvy decided that he would be Nivik Ogre. So you see what he did there. Nivik, Kevin, Kevin. So that's pretty clever, right? All right, so you gotta admit, Nivik sounds pretty stupid, right? Sounds pretty lame. But Ogre is actually a pretty cool nickname for somebody whose last name is Ogilvy. So inevitably everyone would soon just call him Ogre. So he had one name, kind of like Madonna. All of this was later complicated by the fact that they got a producer whose last name was also Ogilvy, no relation to Ogre, and everyone called that guy Rave. So you had Kevin, Rave, and Ogre in the band. Everybody knew who everyone else was talking about. The problem was solved. So Kevin Key was the musician, Ogre was the singer. Now, in the 80s, that met the basic requirements of any budding electronic music act. Okay, the formula, in case you weren't aware, was you have one out there flamboyant singer backed by one quiet guy who stood there and just played the synth. And this was the winning formula proven by bands like Suicide, like Soft Cell, Yaz, the Pet Shop Boys. So Skinny Puppy were just going along with this formula. In the mid-80s, they briefly added a guy named Wilhelm Schroeder as a second keyboard player, but he split after a while to form his own band, which you may have heard of. It's called Frontline Assembly, and he now goes by the name Bill Lieb. Anyway, they backfilled Bill with another emergency backup quiet guy who amazingly used his own name, which was Dwayne Rudolph Godel. And this was a key moment, or maybe a Kevin Key moment, in the band, because Dwayne was classically trained and he was hip to new technology and making new sounds, right? So to say he meshed well with Kevin Key would be an understatement. Working together, they took Skinny Puppy in a lot of strange new directions, and they spun off a ton of side projects like the Tear Garden and Doubting Thomas and Cyberactive and Hilt and Download. Ogre would kind of do his own side projects over the years. He first collaborated with Al Jorgensen of Ministry on a track that got onto the RoboCop movie. That was the first RoboCop movie. If you watch the club arrest scene on YouTube, you can hear this song, which was actually called Show Me Your Spine. And Al he attributed it to a fake band he made up called PTP, which was short for Programming the Psycho Drill, if you can believe that. And that was taken from a J.G. Ballard collage. And you don't really hear Ogre in the movie, but you do hear bits of the track. You can actually purchase the track through, Amazon or Al's site or whatever. This is a track that Al has now made available. And it's hilarious because it is a very, very run-of-the-mill track that you would expect somebody who just got a Fairlight CMI to make, because it uses all the, Fairlight orchestral hits and arpeggiated synth and so on. It's it's like a quintessential 80s quote-unquote industrial track. But over that, there's this guy hollering on the studio version, and that guy is Ogre. Ogre toured with Ministry and the Revolting Cocks, famously. He was part of Ministry's Mind Tour in 1990. You can see him on the live video, which I'm sure I'll talk about at some point. He recorded one track with the Revolting Cocks on Beer Steers and Queers, and that track is Get Down, but he was not credited with that because of various contractual issues that were going on. He was part of Pigface. Whenever they started Pigface, he was part of the very first album and tour. He did a really interesting project with Martin Atkins called RX, and it's a fascinating album. Totally recommend it. Ogre at that point was questioning his whole persona and kind of did away with all of the electronic effects and so on that he had become known for, and made a really interesting album without all that stuff. But later on, he created a long-running side project called Ogre. Let me spell that out. That's OHGR. And Ogre is more or less a more rock/pop oriented band than Skinny Puppy. And what's funny about it is Ogre is kind of composed of Ogre and Mark Walk, who are now in Skinny Puppy together. And at times, Kevin Key would even tour with them as their touring drummer. So it was essentially Skinny Puppy in another name, almost in the same way that the Revolting Cocks were Ministry in another name. But, so the point is that Skinny Puppy spawned a ton of side projects and collaborations that were very interesting. So I have to say at this point that I can't emphasize enough that growing up as a teenager in the early 90s, that Skinny Puppy had a kind of mystique, and to some extent they still do. And there was always a question of how they did what they did, because their music was so unusual, and it was immediately recognizable as them, despite all the imitators. And one part of that was that they rarely appeared in media without being distorted or covered up in some way, but not in a Daft Punk kind of way. It's just that they didn't give a lot of interviews. They didn't get a lot of press. And sometimes when they had, band photos taken, they weren't like clearly visible. So we didn't have a good idea as fans of who they really were. And I think growing up, I ended up reading more about them in print than actually seeing the guys. I think they showed up on MTV maybe in a couple interviews, and they definitely were on in 1992 or so with a video for Killing Game. But I don't even think that video was straightforward, if I remember it. It's been a while since I've seen it. But basically, this record here, this video here, Ain't It Dead Yet, was our first chance to really see them, at least until we actually saw them perform in person, which most of us did, thankfully. And their whole pseudonym thing kind of helped with that mystique. And I think it's obvious that Ogre wouldn't have seemed as cool if he had just been plain old Kevin Ogilvy from Vancouver, And ironically, he turned out to be a genuinely nice guy by all accounts, not at all ogre-ish or like his crazy stage persona. But oddly, the one guy he seemed to not get along with was Kevin Key. I mean, they've worked together for years. They're probably like brothers that don't always get along, I imagine, in the same way that Penn and Teller aren't really friends and have never shared a meal together because they just would never think to do that. So Kevin and Ogre aren't pals in the usual sense. But one thing that they both attest to is that that tension of not really getting along is one of the things that contributed to the Skinny Puppy sound. So let's talk about Ain't It Dead Yet in particular. So this was basically representative of their set in 1987. So it contains a lot of tracks from their 4 albums that they had out at this time. Those were Bites, Remission, Mine, The Perpetual Intercourse, and Cleanse, Fold, and Manipulate. So there are 12 tracks here. Oddly, this CD was pressed as one single track. If I'm remembering correctly, you put this into your CD player and it's not split up into separate tracks. You have to listen to the whole thing as one live experience, which is kind of funny. So that perplexed us back in the day. Like with most live performances, at least ideally, it sounded much like the album but louder and with way more energy. So in that sense, this album is to early Skinny Puppy as, in case you didn't feel like showing up, was to early Ministry. So it was the band, but just kind of amped to 11. It was so much more than just listening to a clean studio performance. So there's a great performance here, plenty of energy, but really this CD, I should just throw this thing away, because you really got to watch the live show. You really have to see this thing. It's performance art. It's not really meant to I mean, it's good to listen to it, but to get the whole effect, you really have to watch it. More than other bands, Skinny Puppy were a visual band. They were meant to be seen, and their show had a lot of theatrical elements that weren't simply about playing the music. So let me try to describe the stage here in this performance, which again, just go out to YouTube and watch it. You'll get the idea of what's going on in about 2 minutes. So on stage left is a big raised platform surrounded by keyboards and equipment, and Dwayne is buried in there somewhere, and he's this dude with spiked blonde hair. And among all the other keyboards he has, remember, he's like a classically trained keyboard player, piano player. He had an FM radio feed, so every now and then you just hear these random bursts from the FM radio that are just really incongruous, but somehow are perfect for what it is they're doing and add just the right amount of chaos. Stage right is much the same, but Kevin's up there, and if you haven't seen him before, he's a startling guy. He's probably like 6.5 feet tall, not even including his 80s hair. He's a seriously big dude, and his features, he really leaves an impression. And during one of the tracks, Deep Down Trauma Hounds, he comes out and just beats the hell out of a big 50-gallon oil drum. And sometimes he's playing a drum kit. He has a whole drum kit back there. Kevin's an accomplished drummer. He proved that going on tour with Ogre. He played this insanely huge drum kit that he called Drumosaurus and just owned the thing. So excellent sense of rhythm, great drummer. On this performance, on the song Addiction, he pulls out this white guitar and just starts wailing on it. Man, he's making feedback and noise. He's not really shredding, he's just making textures, and it's awesome. It's exactly what the song needs. And the rest of the stage is Ogre's. He's at all times walking around covered in fake blood, real sweat. He's choking himself on the mic cord. He's acting really weird. He's staring at his hands. He's playing with candles and masks and statues. He's got all sorts of weird props. I mean, you can't just say he was tripping out. I mean, maybe he was. But he's acted that way every time I've seen him on stage. I've been to a bunch of shows. I've watched dozens of shows on YouTube. He's just got a unique stage presence. And whatever he's doing, you're riveted to it because the guy's got charisma. He knows how to front a band. And again, that mystique comes into play. None of us, when we were growing up, really even knew what he looked like. He was almost mythological. A guy named Ogre. It was like he was It's like he was out of a fairy tale, right? But at least in this show, you can see his face. In later years and in other shows, his costumes would get a lot more elaborate. Sometimes you couldn't see him at all. I went to see Skinny Puppy in 2008 in the Insolvent Sea tour, and you couldn't even see the guy's face till the encore. He was just completely covered in all this stuff, and it was great. It was great. He was completely able to emote through all of that. Very interesting. On this gig, every now and then, you can see him wander over in the corner and manipulate his voice on some rack-mounted effects unit, which is kind of funny. So yeah, all in all, the scene of this performance is kind of post-apocalyptic. It's like a gothic B-movie theater vibe, and there's not much in the way of humor with this show. It's very serious. It seems like they're taking themselves pretty seriously, although obviously Kevin's having a lot of fun beating on stuff, and you could see that he's pretty happy back there. But the show was more of like a social commentary, and their next record that they'd released would be Vivisect 6, which is all about the evils of animal testing. So the name's kind of clever, Vivisect 6, so it's like 666. Animal testing is evil, so that's pretty clear. During the shows for, I think it was this tour, they'd actually get arrested for one of their props. So at one point, Ogre had this fake stuffed dog that was fairly realistic, and behind the scenes, they kind of nicknamed this thing Chud, and at one point, Chud got stolen and was later returned, but then after the band pretended to vivisect Chud on stage, they got reported for animal cruelty, ironically, and of course the police then realized, Chud wasn't real, but they did have to go to jail and pay a fine. So fortunately they got through all that insanity. So the theatrics of the shows, the point is that the theatric aspect of the shows could be pretty overwhelming for someone who's expecting a traditional rock show. And Skinny Puppy Live has always been more Rocky Horror Picture than Rocky, if you will. And in some cases, people in the front were probably issued ponchos because they were sitting in the splash zone. So, there were definitely some good, cool effects out there for anybody going to the Skinny Puppy shows. And actually, Al Jorgensen told a funny story in his autobiography about this time, because he was touring the United States and crossing paths with this other band that was leaving fake blood in all the dressing rooms. Meanwhile, Ministry was leaving real blood in all the dressing rooms. And, supposedly, because this is Al telling the story, and you kind of have to take it with a grain of salt. But eventually he realized that Skinny Puppy had the fake blood, and they realized that Al had the real blood, and thus a bond was formed forevermore, at least among Ogre and Al. So let's talk about this a little bit more track by track. So there's an intro. It's just sort of like chaotic noise with a radio, and in the video there's a video clip of a fuse burning, and it goes right into Anger, which is this like faster song with a very hard beat and all this clanking. And during that performance, Ogre's manipulating this weird puppet behind this bloody screen. And I love the song Anger. It's got a lot of energy, but my favorite thing about it is that in the cleanse, fold, and manipulate liner notes, it lists all the lyrics for the songs, and it starts listing a few of the lyrics to Anger, and then it just ends with this phrase, disembodied guttural noise need not make sense, which kind of summarizes the rest of Skinny Puppy's lyrics when you think about it. But it goes right into the choke, and that's about as close as Skinny Puppy get on this performance to a dance track. Ogre comes out from behind his screen and starts doing his thing, and it's a really catchy song. I like it. Addiction is the next song, a very classic track from Cleanse, Fold, and Manipulate. It has a ton of hooks and memorable samples, has Kevin playing drums and keyboard, and I love all the instrument switching that they do during this show. I love watching them move around. It shows that they're really performing the music, you know. So the fifth track is Assimilate, probably Skinny Puppy's hardest early song. It's definitely the song that would make everybody start jumping into the pit. It has these like weird triplets in it. It sounds sort of like a waltz on meth. There's an early demo of Assimilate. It's on Back and Forth. I think it was when Kevin really got the idea for this track. It's the Assimilate original instrumental demo, 3 minutes and 4 seconds. What's weird about it is that it's really mellow and sounds almost like a ballad, but it turned into this like slam dance monster. So after Assimilate is First Aid, which we already talked about, just quintessential puppy track. That goes into Dig It, and this song has almost a hip-hop beat. It's like slower, but kind of poppy, and famously Nine Inch Nails would use this song as an inspiration for the first single of theirs, Down In It. Trent straight up admits that. Skinny Puppy helped Nine Inch Nails get their start because Nine Inch Nails opened for them on tour at one point in time. So everybody likes Dig It, including Trent Reznor. One Time, One Place is on here. It's a pretty cool song. It was misnamed on early prints of this CD as God's Gift Maggot, which is a completely different song, but I'm pretty sure that, yeah, it's still listed as God's Gift Maggot on the VHS tape. So there you go. Don't trust your VHS tapes. That goes into one of my favorite tracks, which is Deep Down Trauma Hounds. It has super tense synths, really hard drums, and just like badass samples that come in. Just great stuff, and a great example of how Skinny Puppy can arrange all this noise in a compelling way. And that goes into Chainsaw, which is one of their singles. I mean, who doesn't like songs about chainsaws? That's badass. It lists the next song as Brap, but I think that's actually a song from Cleanse, Fold, and Manipulate called Draining Faces, according to Wikipedia. Brap, the whole name Brap is interesting. I should explain what that means. So Skinny Puppy would normally use that term to mean an improvisation of some kind. So they would, release a live recording and then say that this segment of it was just them brapping. And what brapping was in their mind was to just get together, hook up a bunch of electronic instruments, get high, and record. And I think they actually listed that definition of brap on their very first retrospective CD collection that they came out with around 2000 or so. They finally explained what they meant by that word. But again, I think this track on this record is actually Draining Faces. And finally, they end with Smothered Hope, another classic Skinny Puppy track. Ministry and the Revolting Cocks would cover this regularly whenever Ogre went on tour with them, and he would sing that song. And I think Smothered Hope is actually, an early version of it is on Back and Forth as well. Was it? Maybe not. Oh yeah, here, Smothered Hope Demo, track 12. There you go. I thought I was misremembering that, but... And I think there's a picture in here. You know, this gives you an idea of what a Skinny Puppy show might look like. You know, Ogre's got a mask there, lots of like gothic horror elements and smoke and crazy blood, and it sort of looks like you're doing a concert in the midst of the Doom video game. So the other thing to point out is that the interesting thing is that these tracks all kind of blend into one another. So it's not like they would just perform a show and yell, "Thank you," and the house lights go down, and 30 seconds later the next song comes in. Everything kind of smoothly segues from one song to another because, again, they were well versed at improvisation and they were able to kind of pull that off. So the tunes are very loose and noisy, but they do follow the recordings really well. I mean, each of the songs really did have a nailed down arrangement, and they followed it very well. But again, so much energy that's added here in a live environment, just an outstanding performance and really fun to listen to. So what did they do after this show? Well, obviously they went on to the best part of their career. They'd go on to release many more classic albums after this. They came out with Vivisect 6. I think I showed that earlier. We have Vivisect 6, we have Rabies, one I really want to talk about at some point, and probably my favorite Skinny Puppy album, Too Dark Park, which I don't have an actual CD of at this point. They came out with Last Rites, and finally The Process in 1995. So what happened then was Dwayne had an untimely death in 95, which kind of broke the band up for a bunch of years. Turns out they would reunite in the 2000s. They'd end up releasing 4 more albums. They're still together today. They still occasionally tour. It's been a while since they had an album, but they still tour. And, you know, it's crazy to think that they were putting out albums every year for so many years during the late 80s, early 90s. Like, there'd be a new album every year. They were just recording and touring and releasing these classic albums like a machine. They're all great albums. So clearly, like, in my mind, that period of Skinny Puppy, they were at their creative peak for sure. So why do I love this CD? Again, like, this is a best of, in my mind, of early Skinny Puppy. And as a live recording, it just presents these songs with so much more energy. It's just a great performance. And that's really captured in the video. You can really watch that video and get a good idea of what Skinny Puppy is all about. So the theatrics and the complicated arrangements, and they had this anything goes attitude toward vocals and instrument switching, really creative stuff. Kevin and Dwayne at that time were working hand in hand, like two sides of the same brain, and they were really stretching the sound and the performance. And more importantly to me, there's a lot going on stage. They're not just pressing play like electronic bands would do in subsequent decades. Like, they're actually playing this whole music. Essentially, their entire studio is on stage, and you're watching them recreate the music in real time. And it's just fun to watch them do that. Ogre was doing his thing as ever. He's also fun to watch, of course. And I mean, one thing that strikes me watching it again now is that it's pretty clear watching this where Marilyn Manson got his whole shtick. I mean, he pretty much stole it straight up from Ogre. So Ogre was Manson 10 years before Manson knew what the hell he was doing. But again, this gig as video captured Skinny Puppy in the way that, in case you didn't feel like showing up, captured Ministry at their peak, in my opinion, in 1990. And again, oddly, I don't think I actually saw this video until the early 2000s. But when I got it, I remember just being mesmerized by it. It was just one of the craziest things I'd ever seen, and it was just fascinating to me to watch them play this music and perform it the way they performed it. It's just undeniable that you could say a lot of bands have a unique sound, but that goes doubly so for Skinny Puppy. I mean, thousands of wannabe industrial bands would try to copy what it is they do. There are interviews on YouTube of Trent Reznor after he became famous. You know, people would give him their demo tapes. And he talks frankly about how he'd listen to those demo tapes and just immediately throw out all the ones that he knew were obviously trying to copy Skinny Puppy because they just weren't being creative. There's only one Skinny Puppy, even though Trent even readily admits that he started his career by more or less aping what Skinny Puppy were doing. You know, Dig It became Down in It and became the rest of his career. But yeah, so you might say that they have a formula, and it's easy to think you know what they're doing. It's easy to maybe approximate, but it's really hard to get it right. I think the mix that they had stemmed from Dwayne's classical training and Kevin's love for electronics and the deep professional bond that those two guys had, and from Ogre's just unique vocal and stage talents. They were the right guys in the right place, and there was no one else like them doing what they did at the time. So their success, in my mind, depended a lot on those particular personalities that were in the band. And it all melted together and in a way that looked and like nothing else. No matter how much you tried to copy it, you couldn't copy it. So there you go, Skinny Puppy. Often imitated, never duplicated. But in any case, that's all I have for you today. If you like this discussion, stay tuned. I'll talk more about old ass but awesome 80s and 90s music in future episodes. Stronger Than Reason is on YouTube and is available as a podcast. So, as the kids say today, please like and subscribe. And until then, see you next time and stay strong.